Well, welcome to Family Sabbath. Every fifth Sabbath, if there's 5 Sabbaths in a month, we all get together. Instead of having children's church, the kids come in here and we sing some family-friendly songs, some from VBS, and we have a lot of good stuff happening. We have on Family Sabbath, we also have Morning Blend, and we had a good time this morning with doing some trivia. We had some good food. We had some time to draw out some important parts of our spiritual journey and learn to connect with God in a different way. So if you didn't make it to this morning's blend, come next 5th Sabbath. I think it's going to be the last Sabbath of December. Mark your calendars for that and join us at 9:30 for that good time. Part of the quiz we had for the Bible Bowl, there was one question. See if any of you remember it, or if you remember the answer. Uz and Buzz are the nephews of what patriarch? Abraham, right. And so Uz was the firstborn. Rod was wanting some more information about this. You can find it in Genesis 22, verse 21. Uz, the firstborn, Buzz, his brother, Kemuel, who is the father of Aram. So that's how he's kind of connected there to Abraham. Anyways, we got some prizes, had some good time. But today, after we sing some songs, we're going to continue on with our series on the covenants of grace. We're going to look at law and love and how that connects into this concept, into the series we've been looking at on the covenants in the Old New Testaments, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Law and love. Did you know that in the 13 and 1400s, animals occasionally would be put on trial? Did you know that? And in fact, can you imagine? We have an animal joining us today here. We saw some crested geckos, but here we have a little kitten. What's the kitten's name, Sydney? Stormy. All right, for now at least. Yeah. Stormy, very cute. How many of you have cats or have had cats at one point in your lives? Yeah, almost all of us have. Can you imagine putting little Stormy on trial? Say, you know what, Stormy, you drank my milk. I'm going to have you arrested, all right? Would that go over pretty well, do you think? No, Stormy's too cute to be put on trial, right? Well, thank you, Sydney. I mean, Stormy putting on trial, that sounds a little ridiculous, and yet they did. In the 1300s, and the 1400s, you would see stories of animals getting put on trial. There was once a moth that was put on trial because she had destroyed. It was a clothes moth. It ate clothes and actually destroyed a very valuable tapestry. And so actually this moth was sentenced to death. They were sentenced to be executed, which really wasn't fair because it wasn't the moth that actually ate the stuff, it was her larvae, you know? Another time in France, some beetles were put on trial because they had come in and destroyed a whole crop of the farmers there. And so they were so angry that they wanted to charge these beetles with crimes. Unfortunately, the beetles didn't show up to the courthouse, so the case was kind of dropped. But yeah, I mean, there's animals that would be charged. I think in the mid 1400s, there was a bull in Spain that was put on trial because he had gored a man, and so they wanted to serve justice to these animals. I know it kind of sounds a little silly, right? To put an animal on trial, to try to blame Stormy for for her drinking my milk or whatever. But the truth is, laws are important. Maybe not laws applied to animals, but we have laws for a reason. I don't think any of us would like to live in a part of the world that didn't have any laws, right? It wouldn't be so fun to live in a place where someone could come in and steal your stuff or beat you up or even kill you just because they felt like it, and there'd be no consequences, there'd be no repercussions. No one would want to live in a place like that. Laws are important to us. They help us. They help protect us. They help us be safe. They help us live good lives. And we've been looking at this old covenant and this new covenant. And we've seen that there's actually, a lot of people think that the old covenant is all about laws. In fact, they've counted them up and they said when God gives this old covenant to Israel at Mount Sinai, we studied and we seen that actually there's several covenants sprinkled throughout the Old Testament. But when God gives this old covenant to the Israelites at Mount Sinai, he actually gives them 613 more laws. And we think, man, that's a lot of laws. Some Christians, they think, 613 laws, that was just such a legalistic view of a religious experience. And those poor Israelites, they just had to live under the old covenant of a ton of laws. Do you have any idea how many laws we have in the United States? A lot. No one actually knows how many laws we have in this country. That's, no one had a right answer here because no one has the right answer in general. In 1980, someone, I think somewhere in the government, asked for a study to be commissioned to find out how many federal laws there were. And 4 years later, in 1984, they said, so what did you find out? And the organization that was in charge of finding out how many laws there were, they said, well, we're still counting. In 2000, they had a rough estimate. Someone kind of gave a rough estimate that there is somewhere between 15,000 and 50,000 laws in our country. 15 to 50,000 federal national laws. That makes 613 not sound so bad, right? Especially when you consider that 613 covered pretty much every aspect of life. It covered, ceremonial laws and health laws and religious laws and civil laws. 613 doesn't seem to be that many. In fact, I think there's probably more than 613 laws and ordinances here in just the city of Tracy, much less for an entire nation of Israel. And it would be a shame if you thought of these 613 laws as just a code of legality, because it was so much more than that. Robert S. Rayburn, a Christian pastor and theologian, he writes that it would be a great mistake to view the law as mere regulation. It is divine communication and guidance. The greatest privilege was to be the friend of God, and in being his friend, there was great reward. In the law was revealed the way to live as God's friend. This is what the 613 laws were about. They weren't just about, making sure you did this and do that and do this. The core of these laws was about living in friendship with God. See, the truth is, obedience in the covenants, in that everlasting, overarching covenant of grace, is inspired by love, motivated by love, and rendered in love. This is the connection between law and love, that obedience to the law is always deeply rooted and connected to love. It is inspired by love, motivated by love, and rendered in love. And so we come to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the last book of the Torah. And it is known as the covenant book. This is the book that scholars has identified as the book of the Old Covenant. This is where you find a majority of those 613 laws. This is the book that was so important to the Israelites because it served to be that rule book, that law book that reminded them of this covenant relationship that they were in with God. The book of Deuteronomy was so important to the Israelites because it was the covenant book that a master copy was to be kept at all times in the sanctuary and later on in the temple. Not only that, but when a new king came to power, a ruler came to power in Israel, that king was required by law to make his own copy of the book of Deuteronomy so that he would have his own personal copy to read and to study. More than that, the book of Deuteronomy, it was required for the king to gather the people together in great assemblies and for him to read the book of Deuteronomy to them out loud from time to time. Because Deuteronomy was this significant book of the covenant. And so we would expect to find that Deuteronomy is a very legalistic book, wouldn't we? I mean, we would expect to find it jam-packed with rules, with laws, with commands. We would expect it to be in the top 5 of most legalistic books in the Bible. So let's take a look at some of what Deuteronomy has to say. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 8 and 9 says, "But it was because the Lord loved you." Okay, well, let's keep going. "And kept the oath he swore to your ancestors, that he redeemed you from the land of slavery. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of rules." No, his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments. Sounds interesting. That this book of the covenant is rooted in love. Well, let's keep looking at it. A few chapters later, Deuteronomy 10, verse 15 says, "Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and loved them." All right, well, maybe you're starting to get the picture. Deuteronomy 23, verse 5 says, "However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you." Now you might be thinking, okay, Pastor, you're just picking and choosing maybe the three passages that talk about love in this whole book on law. I challenge you, though, to read the book of Deuteronomy. Because when you do, you're going to find out, like Skip McCarty, a well-known Adventist pastor and theologian, he writes in his book, In Granite or Ingrained, in Deuteronomy, this covenant book, the word love, referring to God's love for his people or their need to love him and others, occurs more times than in any other Bible book except Psalms, Hosea, John, and 1 John. What? This book of the covenant, this book of law, is actually not a top 5 legalistic book. It's a top 5 book of love out of the entire canon of Scripture. See, God's love for humanity was the foundation of his commandments and our foundation for keeping them. It is because God loved you and loved me and has loved humanity since the beginning of time that he gives us these laws. They are at the foundation of his laws, of his commands. And it is also the foundation for us to follow and to obey his rules, his laws, and his commands. Now, it is true, you're going to find when you read Deuteronomy, some of the passages are going to be expressed with some stern words, but it's to be read in the context of a parent lovingly telling their child, warning their child about some dangerous or risky behavior, not in the context of a master threatening to punish his slaves. I know we have children here in the sanctuary today. How many of you have been told not to do something by your parents? All right, I see a lot of hands going up, even some older kids back there. Mr. Western, yes. But parents, that when you have told your kids not to do something, how many of you have told your kids not to do something because you love them? All right. And I see a lot of the parents raising their hands too. Because that's the way it works a lot of times. Sometimes the kids might not agree. They might not see the big picture. But as parents, a lot of the times, hopefully all the times, you tell your kids not to do something or warn them about something or even give them consequences for their behavior. It's because ultimately you love them and want the best for them. And this is exactly what we find in Deuteronomy. Chapter 10, verses 12 to 13, it says, "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good." We see that there's this intimate connection between obeying what God has given or told us to do, what he has commanded us to do, and love. And we see that this connection, that this bond between obedience and love really comes out of the ultimate purpose of God wanting things to happen for your own good and for my own good. Obedience in the covenant, in the everlasting covenant, is inspired by love, motivated by love, and rendered in love. But what about the New Testament? A lot of times people come to the New Testament, they think, oh, all of those laws were done away with. You know, the New Testament really just is about principles. And so we have to ask that question. Does the New Covenant have general principles instead of detailed specific laws? If you ask this question to many Christians, they're going to say yes, because the principle is love. The New Testament really gets rid of all of that Old Testament stuff. The New Covenant really gets rid of all that Old Covenant stuff and replaces it with the principle, the general principle of love. But is that really the case? Skip McCarty continues, and he says, a reading of the New Testament, looking for the commands it contains, will find over 900 direct commands and 300 indirect commands. 900 and 300, add them together, you have 1,200 commands in the New Testament, which is compared to the Old Covenant of 613, it almost doubles the commands that you find in the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant, the Old Testament versus the New Testament. So what's going on here? Is really the New Testament a legalistic approach? Have we got it all wrong? Is the New Covenant really about rules and regulations and legalism as well? What's happening if actually the commands are doubled from the Old Covenant commands? Well, we see here just one example of these 1,200 or so commands in the New Testament. Ephesians, Paul writes to the Christians in Ephesus, chapter 5, starting verse 3. He says, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. Paul's saying, here are some very specific commands that you need to follow. And he said these are serious things. All the New Testament authors that give commands, they all expect them to be taken seriously, because he continues in verse 5 and he says, for of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person as an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. He says, look, you have to take this stuff seriously. Paul doesn't say here in Ephesians 5 that, oh, you're immoral, you're impure, you're greedy, no big deal, it's all good, don't worry about it. He says, no, if this is how you live your life, you're in danger. You're making wrong choices, because if you've chosen to live a life that is immoral and impure and greedy, the consequence is going to be that you're going to lose out on the kingdom of God. This is serious stuff. This is important stuff. These rules, these laws, these 1,200 or so commands were meant to be taken seriously. And so what are the implications here? What are the implications of all of these New Testament laws? I think there's three pretty major implications. The first is that nobody thought that this general principle of love could replace specific laws for sinful people. We see everyone from Jesus to Peter to Paul giving specific, direct commands. If they were just generally saying, oh, it's all about love, you could probably cut the New Testament in half. They repeated these commands, they repeated these rules, because they understood that even though these rules, even though the general principle is love, Jesus did say that the greatest command is to love God and to love each other, that the underlying fundamental foundational principle is love, that they knew that as sinful people, with our warped understanding of truth, with our warped understanding of how we interact with this world, that we needed some practical, hands-on demonstrations and explanations and examples of this principle of love and how it plays out in our lives. how this love towards God and how our love towards our fellow humans plays out. And so that is why they give us specific examples of how to live out this underlying principle of love. The second implication is that it's not a number of laws that causes legalism, but an attitude towards those laws. It doesn't matter if you had 600 laws or 1,200 laws or one law. Legalism isn't about the number of laws, it's about an attitude, how you approach those hundreds or thousands or singular law. If it really was only about one law, if the law that Jesus said, a new command I give you, if there's only one command, this new command I give you, to love one another as I have loved you, if that was the only thing that we had to worry about, I can guarantee you that there would be legalists when it came to that one law. Okay, I have to love everyone like Jesus loved me. So did I feed my neighbor? Okay, I can check that off my list. Did I help my neighbor feel better? Okay, I can check that off my list. Okay, did I provide for my neighbor? Did I help? And they can warp even that single law, a single command, into a legalistic approach to things. And so that's why it's not about having 1,200 laws or 613 laws. It's about this experience. It's not an old covenant period, a new covenant period. It's having that new covenant experience where we find that it's not about the laws. It's not about finding a legal way to earn your own salvation. It always comes down to accepting the grace of Jesus. And that changes the way you interact. It changes your attitude towards the law, whether it's one or a million. The third implication is that God's commands always represent His promises to be claimed by faith. God's commands always, from the old covenant time to the new covenant time, they are always rooted, they are always examples of His promises that we can claim by faith. Because it's not about, I need to follow this and I need to do this because I need to get to heaven. It's not, okay, God says I can't lie, so I'm not going to lie so I can keep that box checked. It's not about, okay, I'm not going to steal anything because that's what God commanded, so I'm going to do that because that's what I have to do. Whether it's the Old Testament, the New Testament, Old Covenant, New Covenant, these are actually promises that God makes. That when you have an encounter with me, when you have that new covenant experience, you're going to see that it's not about focusing on these laws. It's about the promise of what your life is going to be once you have encountered me. That once you have an encounter with Jesus Christ, it's not, oh, I have to worry about telling the truth. It's about, oh, Jesus is changing my life to be a person of integrity. We don't have to worry about the laws that say, oh, I can't kill anybody. So, oh, Jesus is changing my life so now that I value other people's lives. That these are the promises that God is making to us, that when we have an encounter with Him, when we have that new covenant experience with Him, that those laws that we used to be so hung up on, so focused on, those are actually promises of how our lives are going to look now because of what Jesus is doing for you and me. Because obedience in the covenants is inspired by love, motivated by love, and rendered in love. And so we come to this bit of a theme we find in the Gospels, in the life and teachings of Jesus. This concept of the unbearable yoke versus the easy yoke. I know we don't talk about yokes too much in today's world besides the yolks that are in eggs, right? But yoke, spelled a little differently, those are those things around the oxen's neck, the heavy wooden things that keep them together. But we see Jesus in His teachings, He talks about an unbearable yoke, a heavy load, a heavy burden. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew, one of the disciples who wrote down his eyewitness account of the life and teaching of Christ, he quotes Jesus talking about the religious leaders of his day. Jesus says that these religious leaders crush people with unbearable religious demands and never lift a finger to ease the burden. In other translations, Jesus says that they weigh down, they put weights on the shoulders of people without ever trying to help. We get this concept of this heavy yoke that the religious leaders are putting on the people. And this yoke, what Jesus is talking about, isn't a physical yoke. They don't walk around with a big, heavy wooden necklace. You know, what he's saying is these religious leaders are trying to tell you that you need to keep the law in order to be saved. And so people go around weighed down because they're not perfect. They make mistakes and they do sin. And even though sometimes they try their best not to, sometimes their inclination, their human inclination wins out and it just weighs on them that oh, I can't be perfect. I'm messed up and I'm not going to be able to be saved because I messed up here and I did this wrong or I said that wrong. And so people are walking around with these heavy burdens weighing them down because their religious leaders were telling them that they were messed up and that they were going to go to hell because they weren't perfectly obeying God's law. But Jesus says in another place in Matthew, chapter 11, starting in verse 28, Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who have been weighed down by these religious leaders' expectations. Come to me, all of you who think that you have to earn your own salvation by being perfect. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." Don't get burdened down by these other religious leaders that have things totally messed up and mixed up and are so confused. Come to me. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. You will find rest in your souls that are so burdened, are so heavy laden with this expectation of perfection. Your souls have this wrong concept of, you've been taught this wrong concept of how you need to obey and why you need to obey. Jesus, come to me, I will give you rest and you will see the truth. That it's not about you perfectly obeying the law. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. Jesus says, I'm telling you things, I'm giving you commands, just like these other teachers of the law do, just like these other Pharisees and Sadducees do. But my yoke is easy to bear. The burden I give you is light, because my yoke isn't really about you. My yoke isn't about your ability to be perfect. My yoke is about you trusting and accepting my perfection. My yoke isn't about you trying to save yourself. My yoke is about allowing me to save you. My yoke isn't about you trying to earn your own righteousness. My yoke is about accepting the righteousness of Christ. This is what Jesus is saying, that this old covenant experience needs to be done away with because it is so burdensome and it is so soul-crushing that when people come to Him to experience something new, that it's going to be something so completely different. It's going to be so freeing, so wonderful, so amazing, that it's going to be ultimately life-changing. Not because there's no rules or no commands or no laws, but it's life-changing because all of that is found in Christ and not in ourselves. Ellen White, one of the founders of our church, who's written some really amazing, inspirational things, she says, you and I can have a little heaven here below if you will only get your eye fixed upon God, not looking at Christ half the time and the world the other half. When you live for God, He will put His everlasting arm beneath you, and then He says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. She is saying that that when we accept this yoke of Christ, when we accept the commands that He has given to us, the commands that He wants, that are actually promises in our lives, that's when actually we begin to get a preview of heaven in our lives. Because no longer is it about us keeping this laundry list of laws and rules and commands and trying to do them perfectly. Now instead of focusing on that, we get to just sit back, put our faith in Jesus, and watch as He transforms our lives. And so Jesus, when we have that new covenant experience, He takes our life that was so consumed with being right, with being self-righteous, with keeping these rules and these regulations, and Jesus changes it. And He says, no, look, you don't have to worry about that anymore, because these aren't rules anymore, these are promises. He says, now instead of being all caught up about being impure, let me make you pure. Instead of being so caught up about being immoral, let me give you a new morality. Instead of being so worried about money and finances and greed, that you become greedy, Jesus says, let me make you generous. And when you've been transformed through this new covenant experience, we can have lives that are moral and pure and generous and full of peace without that worry and doubt, and full of joy and excitement and love. Those are the lives that we get to experience in heaven. And Jesus says when you have that new experience, that new covenant experience, you'll get to get a taste of that here on earth. So this morning, the choice for you and I is, what kind of experience are we going to have? Are we going to have an old covenant experience? Or are you going to continue to be caught up in the rules and the laws and the regulations to try to earn your own salvation? Or are we going to have a new covenant experience? Are you going to accept the salvation of Christ and His righteousness and allow Him to change your life accordingly? I know that I want to have that preview of heaven in my own life. Do you? Amen.